Imagine, if you will, a $15 an hour wage into an insurance structure. Now, the insurance structure, being the primary mechanism, would pay out in its functional bonuses, at which point the person would not take $15 an hour home. They would be paying into their account, automating their wish list, which has to, at a minimum, include the risk management insurance structure, which facilitates the dividing of their account by the accountants through the insurance companies, which generate their connection to their wishes, at which point the net obligation of reasonable precautions in order to subvert the threats against them, such as the use of education through the School of Hard Knocks from the network's obstructed education structure, being in an Ivy League school, is projected to be in the 30s. It's like usually 30 to 35,000 for most Ivy League schools or something like this. At which point, if you have $15 an hour, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, and then by definition, the norm, if you started work at 15, would be 31,200 a year, at which point that, dividing into the subversion of the risk through the insurance market, facilitates the assumption that 15 goes into 25, which, being 10 years, will put them up to 30,000. From the 3,000 to the 30,000 in the 10 years. So if you have 3,000 in that year specifically put aside, then you have 30,000. Now, if you conduct the insurance structure to actively have other assistance in the mutual aid co-coverage functions, then you can get to the rest of the way of the education of the cost of doing business at the school, at which point the cost of the school, being functionally covered by the various mechanisms, has the first 30,000 originally settled in the bonus credit score by the time that they would be 25, which maintains their ability to actively mature the advancements of those apprenticeships, which would actively be a part of those contract schedules, at which point, if they're working as an apprentice in the general labor function and they're getting the $15 an hour, then their apprenticeship is their first line of expertise in their resume, and then the first year of their school is paid for in that 10-year saving structure, which initiates the rest of it. At which point, that first year, divided into its working function, would actively have work contracts specific to the school, at which point you would have different interests at different stages. So, like if you're if you're a 15-year-old up to college age, then you're probably not going to have too much saved for the college itself. You're probably just going to do the 300 a year, or 3,000 a year rather. At which point, when you get into the school, it becomes more significant. At which point, you're relying on the various forms of the insurance at the different rates, which facilitates the maximized returns, allowing you to work your way through school with minimal debt once you've exited. At which point, that 30,000 divides more effectively amongst the 8-year PhD, um, which I think comes out to 3,750. And then you can do the assumption of scholarships, such as the use of 5,000 per scholarship, I believe, is the max tax write-off, which they would actively be conducting, especially if they're trying to accelerate bonus credit scores, which many of the up and comings would actively have been doing and putting that aside, which facilitate 8,550, give or take, based upon the donation itself. It might be various different. So if the year is three 35,000, then you're probably going to have 25,000 to 30,000 worth of debt, which could easily be covered in the long-term management, which most of this relying upon the intertangled mechanism of the insurance structure would actively accelerate the bonus credit scores in order to facilitate the normal function of the general society in the building of confidence, especially in the construction of the network interest business line, which could contract the uh, promised uh, engagement of being able to conduct them getting into certain jobs or contract schedules, which manifests the confidence and realization of grace for any of those loans in question under the original policies, which would facilitate a reasonable projection of the status quo of the obstructed community. Now, if you're working some kind of apprenticeship deal, then by definition, if you get 7 members of the established board or company facilitating 5,000 each, then the 7 each creates the 35,000, which would redirect the disillusionment of the primary investment into the loan, which would manufacture the guaranteed services into those apprenticeships, normalizing the structure of the general society into the work environment. So, for instance, if you have parents, then 5,000 each with the tax write-off generates the 10,000 of that, leaving 5 to gain. The assumption being that you could easily find the management of most of this money somewhere. It's just a question of having the collective network actively settle on the customs and norms of each jurisdiction. So you would find many of them having the an easy 16,250 to have to settle for the school year, which could be conducted through the various works specifically aligned towards the expertise in the various specific focus. Now, with the contracted wish schedule, which would facilitate the active frequency of purchase and exchanges of contracts inside the market, you would have actively had an indicator to the calculation of the algorithm of the brokerage um, about the network interest of actively conducting the frequency of money, which, as long as it's retained inside the network, would probably be a generation of good faith of the payment of all liabilities, so long as the function of the stability of the frequency of money is being satisfied, which is a higher interest to the network than paying the dividends themselves. As the debts are long term structured, the activity of the frequency of money sustains the market in the various engagements. So if you gave up the frequency of money according to the interest in order to pay off those loans, then you would actually be hurting the network as a whole rather than assisting the particulars, at which point the assumption of elbow room and grace and understanding the various complications that would come up would actively be presumed to side on behalf of the weaker party. Historic threats, such as to the black community, would actively make the management of making women a PhD focused community rather than the men would specifically reduce the estimate of lynches as the men would actively be intimidating them, at which point The assumption that that would be a norm would put women at the PhD level normally with inside the account structures, which facilitates the assumption of active assistance with the school itself, which would require the collaboration of the school to facilitate work assistance, which generates the ability uh, to reduce the cost of the education, which, if the women are doing as the function of the work, then the total cost going down can then actively be conducted in the graces with them, which would facilitate, on average, the remainder of the bill within a reasonable margin, depending upon the various situations. So if they actively incorporated their work schedule into the school itself, such as cooking lessons and cleaning and making study guides and the rest of the assistance to those functions, it would hyper accelerate the experience, reducing the cost to the teachers and the general faculty, which would be conducted as the foundation of the exponential services that could be provided, which actively overlap into school themselves. At which point, the only real problem being the assumption of childcare being fundamentally necessary to many of them and to the staff in large, which could easily again overlap into extracurricular advantages or services which they could have arranged in that system, which could manufacture the total justification of their balance once you collect enough things that I haven't been able to research enough. Now, the brokerage setting up the wish list counter on-site the brokerage would actively have accelerated the potential of the future possibilities to be calculated for each of the students, which would actively make the tailored classes towards the general interests, which would facilitate the use of overlapping use of the homework, at which point uh, the assumption is that they wouldn't throw away any of the homework which is specific to them, which they would actively refer to in the function of their own job. So once they've graduated, they have a bunch of notes to actively assist in their ability to maintain the business, which is actively being reviewed inside the schools under each of the projected majors, along with the other interests. At which point, having conducted a lot of the legwork in the tranquility of the education system, would facilitate a lot of more functional acceleration inside the workplace, because once you have those notes finished, once you have the homework finished and graded and refined over the classes, you would actively be able to just give the notes to any apprentice, at which point you would be able to reliably be able to finish the work, as the apprentice would be able to do everything that you have already finished, and you just need someone to be able to follow basic instructions laid out in the homework. At which point the question becomes who you're trying to collect from the school in order to gobble up in the apprenticeship uh, before other people do. At which point the assumption that the would be chaotic for them to constantly fight over employees once they've been acquired means by definition you would have had to have settled it ahead of time. So you would have had to have seeded your investment into all of the parties, actively gaining the influence during their vulnerability without any extortion, which would actively stabilize a positive market. So the ease of being able to find the people who are most effective in collaborations with you would actively be a high interest of the network from the individual's point of view, which would accelerate the use and function of the bonus credit system, which would actively keep track of all of these reliability scores, which generates the capacity to, uh, gobble up the majority of the population as the rest of them fight over the scrap, which would actively be attached from the theory into the businesses themselves as uh, the better credit score would facilitate subcontract partnerships into larger corporations. So, like if a larger company needs 10 jobs to be done, then they subcontract to the companies. At which point, 10 employees subcontracting as a company would be able to facilitate filling those slots, at which point their investment into the credit score would actively facilitate the acceleration of their engagement as credit, uh, as the primary mechanism to prove to an algorithm which most people would be relying on in order to accelerate or promote or give raises, etc., to each of the various parties. So you can't really take credit for somebody else's work if your company is the first stamp on the function, which generates the subversion of actively being suppressed by the manager function, as they are primarily just exchanging services or papers directly. So the more they put into their particular companies, the higher they would accelerate on the basis of having better resources, which would actively be competing over the various services, attaching for the self-sorting mechanism of the market. Now, the assumption of bigotry in other markets, such as racism or sexism or etc., uh, doesn't have these advantages, as you can conceal bigotry without the numbers, but inside the active trained mechanism of um, the oppressed parties, such as black women who have been studying the entire subject, have been able to look at the entire subject and arrange the risk management, which is co-examined exponentially, especially inside the classes themselves, which would refine to the highest potential the ability to solve for their most basic problems outside of that market, facilitating the biggest threat they assumed David as the patriarchy would give to the other markets, especially the white nationalist markets, which is something to compare themselves to. Now, the gaslighting works because you don't have other systems that have been proven and verified. But if you have something that's proven and verified and stable and competent, then they can just point to that and say, why can't I just do that? I want that. But then it comes up to the position where they are actually just a bigoted piece of shit, at which point they get embarrassed and flustered and angry and they need someone to take it out on, and they can't obviously demonstrate that racism, bigotry, etc. on those parties, so they have to retaliate against the rival competition, or other organizations or societies, which primarily asserts to the position of they have to kill the patriarchy, as they chant in the streets, "Death to the patriarchy, death to the patriarchy," which is a variation of the protocols of learned elder Zion strategy of dismantle the aristocracy that works for the people in order to subjugate them under your slavery possession. So when you think about various problems of reliability, you actively conduct, are they actively getting drunk at work? Are they able to get to work? Driving would actively be a part of it. So the insurance for driving would actively be necessary for that. Your active support classes for your ability to manage various emergencies that would happen on the way as an aspect of your education and your resume would actively reinforce uh, how competently you would be able to be trusted. These types of things compound exponentially for the algorithm, which would calculate the viability of each decision. So if you actually have a competent problem in question, it's a rounding error and not a status quo fault of education. Now, with the assertion of the insurance market as the general structure, you would have bonds covering each of the various services, which generates the position of each of the defaults going into the bonds, which guarantees the structure of the active movement of the market despite the obstruction, at which point any of the delays can be compensated for, at which point the compensation itself facilitates the refilling of the bonds and the normalization of the stable market against various troubles, such as the early threat of the lynch mobs from the white nationalists. Imagine, for example, a party who wants to make a partner in the future would actively have to accelerate the access to the higher value education, which could actively collaborate to the function, at which point the use of the investing into the purchase of credit with the specific party directly would allow for the creation of the example for a scholarship. So let's say they're building their credit at the hyperlocal level. The hyperlocal level of the pre-investment into the company starter funds, being able to conduct the recommended cap of 5,000 for the scholarship, would actively pursue the party in that time as a co-worker prospect to make the partnership in the collaboration contracts in the future as they hyper accelerate their cooperation. The interest of actively fighting over the best partners in the future would divide the um, lowest level function of engaging in the forming of desirable company structures, at which point the most attractive aren't necessarily going to get the arrangement so much as it is the most competent. So the most reliable parties would actively be pursued to these ends, or you would actively be investing into catastrophic loss, at which point the higher grade investment demonstrating a trust in the competence of the party would facilitate the normal structure of the accelerated business in those agreements, at which point you would actively be supplementing the function of these higher grade investments into those communities. And since the women are all focusing on the acceleration into the PhD function, the men don't really need to specifically engage in that much of an investment. They might go high school or 4 years of college normally, but in the end, the function would actively be not interesting as the acceleration of opportunities creates apprenticeships, at which point the function requires them to have engaged in the active business organizing of their collaborations and assistance. And the more assistance they have on field, the easier it is for them to conduct the reports asserting their credit score in the reliability of their partnerships, at which point their ability to have engaged in the various mechanisms to convince each party to join in the good faith subversion of the fundamental chaos allows them to settle at those prices which would actively accelerate the function during the work, as the engagement of the intellectual properties would be the excess, which are a sign of good faith on the matured partnership, materializing their ability to form these long-term relationships, which exponentially increases its stability, encouraging the dividing of